Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 5 of our climate change and migration course. It's 2 p.m. here in the UK, so we are ready to start. I'm going to give other people just a couple of extra minutes to join the live stream before we begin in proper. So please just bear with us while we wait for everyone else to get themselves sorted out and online, and we will begin very shortly. Okay, so I'm going to start by just sharing my screen and making sure that everyone can see my slides. So it looks like you can't properly see my screen at the moment, so I'm just going to make sure that we've got that sorted. Just give me 1 second. Okay, great. So I think we're there. I'm going to begin in just a second. I'll just give everyone another minute or so to join the course. Just to let you know that on the live stream today is myself and also my colleague Leanne, who will be handling the chat and looking at your questions as they come in. So we're both here. You'll be able to hear me, and it will be Leanne responding to you in the chat messages if you ask questions throughout the session. As ever, we're live streaming today, but you will be able to rewatch the session whenever you want or catch up at any time in the future. So 1 more minute for people to join, and then we will start the session properly. Okay, so let's begin. I'm gonna start by giving a very quick overview of what this session is and how this session fits into the wider context of the rest of the course. So what I'm going to do is begin with a brief recap of where we've got up to so far with the course, what we've done, and what is still to come. So you will probably remember that the first 3 sessions of the course really covered kind of the mechanics of how climate-linked migration works, how it is that changes in the climate are resulting in altered patterns of heat waves, droughts, typhoons, hurricanes, various different kinds of disasters, and how in turn those altered events are creating new and potentially unexpected patterns of migration and displacement. We looked at how that happens, and we looked at the research methods that help us understand it. And that's what we covered in sessions 1 to 3. We're now into the middle section of the course, which is sessions 4 to 8, which is about the politics and policy of climate-linked migration. It's about the political ideas that inform how governments and institutions are responding to climate-linked migration. It's about the policies that are being promoted to deal with it. And through these sessions 4 to 8, we're looking at a number of different ideas that are informing the debate about this topic. And we're looking at a number of different policy responses to climate-linked migration itself. So if you remember last session, session 4, we looked at neoliberalism. We looked at the idea of neoliberalism and how those political ideas have shaped some of the ways in which states and other institutions are responding to climate-linked migration. What we're doing today is looking at another political idea, but it's not necessarily a political idea that is informing policy in exactly the same way that neoliberalism was. The political idea that we're looking at today is inequality and how different people are affected differently by climate change impacts, and specifically how those different impacts create different patterns of migration and displacement for different people. So that's the context, that's where we've got up to, that's this week's session. The subsequent sessions, we're going to look at another key political idea, political concept, the idea of security and the bearing that that has on climate-linked migration. Then we're going to move into looking at more specific policy ideas and how the international community and various international legal processes are creating policy on climate-linked migration. Then finally, in November and December, we're going to finish up the course with some case studies. So that's a brief recap of where we've got to, a brief overview of the part of the course that we're in, and I hope a kind of very quick snapshot of the session that we're going to look at today. So that's where we are. That's what we've done so far. So this middle part of the session that we're in now, we've done neoliberalism, we're looking at inequality today. Next up is security. August is policy and international law. And then after that, it's international legal processes. So if you're wanting to kind of put those in your calendar so you know what's coming up, then please do. All of that information, as ever, is on the course page. So you can go and you can see which sessions are coming up and what is going on. Okay, so let's focus now on specifically what we're doing in this session. So this session is looking at specifically at the idea of inequality and what that means in the context of climate-linked migration and displacement. So really what we're doing is focusing on why it is that different people, and that could mean any number of different things. It could mean different people based on their religion, on where they live, on their race, on their ethnicity, on their gender. Why it is that different people are affected differently by climate-linked migration and displacement. So what we're doing is looking at the differences between people's circumstances and why those circumstances mean that some people are forced to move by climate-linked hazards and other people are not. Okay, so the big question, the overarching question of this session is when we look across the world, we can see that there are climate-linked events, typhoons, hurricanes, droughts, floods unfolding all over the planet. But some people are forced to move, forced from their homes, or end up migrating as a result of those events, while other people do not. And the patterns of migration, the kinds of migration that people engage in when they are confronted with those events, with those disasters, vary from one place to another. And the question that we're trying to ask is, why is it that some people are affected differently? Why is it that some people are forced to move and others are not? Why is it that some people find themselves in very different circumstances when it comes to their migration and displacement after those kind of climate-linked hazards? What are the driving forces, if you like, behind that inequality? And we're going to do that in quite a specific way. What we're going to do is we're going to examine a series of real climate-linked events, real climate-linked hazards, and the episodes of migration and displacement that unfolded after them. Okay, so we're going to be looking at some specific disasters, and we're going to be looking at collections of disasters, essentially. So we're going to be looking at similar physical events that unfolded in different locations across the world. And what that does is enable us to look at how those differences, how the different patterns of migration that result from what are in some ways similar physical events create very different patterns of migration and displacement, and then to try and unpack why it is that those very similar physical events created very different patterns of migration and displacement depending on where it was in the world that they took place. So it's essentially an exercise of comparing the migration and displacement that results from various disasters in order to understand the ways in which inequality plays out in terms of the migration displacement that is created by them. So what we're going to do is we're looking at 2 types of events here, and we're looking at 5 events in total. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 typhoons or hurricanes. So typhoons and hurricanes are essentially the same meteorological event, but with different names, taking place in different locations. And we're then going to look at 2 droughts that also take place in different locations. So I'll give you a quick rundown of what those events are. So the typhoons and hurricanes that we're going to look at are Typhoon Haiyan, taking place in the Philippines in 2015, Hurricane Katrina, taking place in the United States, and then Hurricane Sandy, also taking place in the United States. And I'll introduce you to those disasters and what happened to them as we go along. Then later on in the session, we're going to look at the episodes of drought, which are the drought in California, which is still ongoing, but sort of reached its peak in 2017, and the Horn of Africa, East Africa drought, which again is still ongoing, but in many ways reached a kind of peak crisis point in 2011 and 12. So those are the disasters that we're going to look at, and we're going to try and we're going to explore, we're going to unpack why it is that they create different patterns of migration when they did. So what I'm going to do is start by just looking at these different hurricanes and typhoons, giving you a little bit of an overview of what happened with each one, and then trying to compare them. So, the first question is, why in particular are we looking at these hurricanes and typhoons? Why have I picked out Typhoon Haiyan and then Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy? Okay, so the idea is essentially that we've got one event from a developing country in the global south, and we then have 2 events from the United States. The reason that we've got 2 events from the United States, which is a wealthy, developed country, in fact, in GDP terms, it's the wealthiest country on the planet. But the idea of picking these 3 events is I want to be able to draw some comparisons between them. Firstly, between the kind of impacts and the kind of displacement that is created by a typhoon strike. Typhoon strike in a southern country, in a developing country, and compare that with the kinds of displacement that is created by a similar kind of physical event, by a hurricane, in a developed country. However, the reason that I've chosen 2 events in the United States to look at is that I want to try and pull out some of the differences between the response and the displacement that was created by those 2 events, by Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, to look at some of the inequality that exists even within wealthy developed countries. So we're looking at inequality on a global scale between wealthy developed countries and countries in the global south. But we're also looking at inequality on a national scale between wealthier parts of the United States and poorer parts of the United States, and specifically even within the direct areas that were hit by those 2 events, how disparities in wealth and income can alter how people are affected by those events, and whether or not they are displaced, and how their welfare, how well they survive, how well they recover after those events. So the idea is to try and look at inequality on multiple levels here, and how that plays into displacement in the context of these kinds of disasters, by looking at an example from the global south and then 2 examples from the United States and the global north. So that's the That's the purpose of looking at these three events. So what I want to try and do first is look at some of the key differences between the impacts of Typhoon Haiyan and the impacts of Hurricane Sandy, and why it was that the level of displacement, the numbers of people that were displaced, and the kind of level of crisis that was created by those events was different. So the first thing I think we need to draw out is that one of the major things that affects whether a disaster like this creates widespread displacement is long-term investment in resilient infrastructure and buildings and housing. And what I mean by that is, if you look at a location which has had perhaps decades and decades of high level of investment in its infrastructure, it is likely to suffer much less destruction during a hurricane strike or a typhoon strike. And in turn, that leads to potentially less displacement. People are more likely to be able to stay if the physical infrastructure around them is providing more protection. And that means everything from infrastructure which has been deliberately put in place to try and cope with disasters like hurricanes and typhoons. But it also means the infrastructure which is just there as part of people's lives, part of the economy, part of people's cities. So in countries where there has been decades or even centuries of high levels of investment, high levels of economic growth, it tends to be the case that buildings are built more robustly, that roads are built more robustly, that sewage systems and electrical supply systems are more modern and more capable of dealing with some of these extreme events. So one of the key differences that we see between Typhoon Haiyan and Hurricane Sandy is, of course, that the amount of physical destruction created by Typhoon Haiyan was far, far greater than the physical destruction created by Hurricane Sandy. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not trying to kind of play down what happened in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. I'm really not. And I also appreciate that sometimes when you begin to make these comparisons, it can sound like you're trying to play people's experiences off against each other. And that's really not the purpose of this. We really are trying to look at kind of general differences. But what we could see is that in the immediate aftermath of those two events, the physical destruction created by Typhoon Haiyan was far more severe than the physical destruction to housing and infrastructure created by Hurricane Sandy. And what that means in terms of displacement, what that means in terms of people moving is quite simple, really. The greater the level of destruction, the greater the chance that your home has been rendered uninhabitable or destroyed completely. The more physical damage that has been created to buildings that you might use as refuge in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, the more that's been destroyed, the more imperative there is, the more need there is for people to move and to move further in order to find safety, to find shelter, and to find somewhere to recover from the immediate impacts of the disaster. So essentially what I'm getting at here is that long-term investment in physical infrastructure is one of the key things that mitigates against high levels of displacement after hurricane and typhoon strikes. So what we can see there is a global inequality, right? It's the case that the United States, as a wealthy, developed country, has had the resources to invest in very robust houses, robust roads, to invest to some extent in very robust power infrastructure, sewage systems, the kind of stuff, the kind of physical infrastructure that's got a better chance of surviving these kind of events. For all sorts of reasons, the Philippines has not had those economic advantages. It has not had that money available to invest in those kinds of public infrastructure. And that infrastructure that it does have is therefore much less resilient to these kinds of extreme events. And the point that I'm getting at is that essentially long-term wealth and long-term investment of that wealth in infrastructure is one of the key factors that determines the level of displacement, even in the face of very similar kinds of events. So that really sums up the key differences that we can see between a wealthy developed country in the US and a developing country in the global south like the Philippines when it comes to a disaster like that. But what I want to do now is try and offer up some comparison between the two events that took place in the United States. So between Hurricane Sandy that we've just looked at and between Hurricane Katrina. Okay, so we're comparing two events, both in the United States, both taking place in a wealthy developed country, but nonetheless resulting in quite different patterns of displacement. So I think what it's imperative to ask there is, given that both of these events took place in a developed country, why is it that the aftermath of those events, and specifically what we're interested here is the displacement caused by those events, why did it result in such different patterns of human movement? So I'm going to try and unpack some of those differences now. So the first point to make is that some of that difference can be explained by the physicality of the storm itself, by the hurricane itself, and some of it can be explained by the physicality, the actual geography of the places that they hit. So what I'm not trying to do here is say that everything to do with who gets displaced, who migrates, and where and when people move is determined by income and infrastructure and housing and investment. But I'm also trying to move us away from the idea that it is only geography, that it is only the nature of the physical event itself and the formation of the land that it hits that determines who gets displaced, right? So it's true that there were some physical differences. There were differences in the power of the hurricanes that struck. There were differences in the amount of rain that they dumped when they landed. There are differences in the kind of the physical coastline, the physical coastlines that they hit when they did. And some of that is key to understanding why there were different patterns of migration and displacement resulting from them. But what I want to do now is try and examine some of the economic and social reasons why there were different kinds of displacement resulting from these two essentially quite similar weather events. Okay, so the first one, amongst the key differences, is that within New Orleans, which was the key area that was hit by Hurricane Katrina, historically there had been less investment in physical infrastructure that was designed to protect the area from these kinds of events. And specifically in the years running up to Hurricane Katrina, there had actually been cuts in the level of investment in the physical infrastructure to protect that area from hurricane strikes, okay? So physical infrastructure was in place, dams and levees and various kinds of physical flood defenses were there, but in the years running up to that event, some of the investment had been drawn back from maintaining and updating and repairing those elements of physical infrastructure. And when Hurricane Katrina did strike, many of those pieces of physical infrastructure failed. And to some extent, their failure was a result of the lack of investment that had been made in them in the preceding years. Now, the case that I'm making here is that during Hurricane Sandy, some of the physical infrastructure that was designed to protect that area of the coastline was in better shape. It had been better maintained. It had received more recent kind of updates and repairs over the years, and that therefore it provided more protection. So what we can see there is a disparity in in the investment in physical infrastructure that's specifically designed to protect people from these kind of events. And lo and behold, it shouldn't really be a surprise, but the result of investing less in that kind of infrastructure is that more people are displaced when these kind of events hit. Okay, so that's the first thing. There's an inequality there in the level of investment in protective infrastructure. The second thing is about housing. Okay, so this is infrastructure, of course, but in a sense, it's private infrastructure rather than public infrastructure. It's people's own homes. But what we can see in New Orleans compared to the area of the east coast of the United States that was hit by Hurricane Sandy was that there was a lot more housing which was of a much lower build quality. And that was largely, or in many respects, that was the result of people who live there having lower incomes, right? So poorer people have less money to invest in their own houses. They're less able to pay high levels of rent, which means that landlords are less likely to invest in making improvements to houses for a number of different reasons, mostly resulting from poverty and low incomes. A lot of the housing in New Orleans was particularly unprepared for an event like Hurricane Katrina. So what we've got there is an inequality, an income inequality between two places in the United States, leading to an inequality in the robustness, the physical robustness of people's actual dwellings, and therefore, when those dwellings are impacted by a disaster like Hurricane Katrina, they are more vulnerable to destruction, and the consequence of that is that people are more likely to be displaced. Now, of course, in the United States, there is obviously a quite stark racial dimension to this inequality. It is, of course, the case that many of the people of color in New Orleans lived in some of the most vulnerable housing, compared to whiter neighborhoods, which tended to be physically more protected, more kind of naturally more protected, more inland from the immediate coastline, whereas people of color tended to live in areas that were more vulnerable and more exposed, and on top of that, in houses which were less robust, right? So there were a number of factors leading to, even within New Orleans, even within the single area that was hit by this one hurricane, we can see inequality playing out on income and along racial lines, leading to some people being much more likely to be displaced than others. Okay, so what I want to try and do now is give a kind of quick sum up of what we've covered by looking at these three events, right? So by comparing Typhoon Haiyan and Hurricane Katrina, we looked at how it is much more possible for a wealthy, a kind of long-developed country to withstand a physical event like a hurricane or a typhoon, and how it is much harder for a developing or a poorer country to deal with those kind of events, and that long-term investment in infrastructure and general high levels of investment in things like housing and robust power grids means that some places in the world are much more able to cope with these kinds of disasters, right? But then by looking at the differences between Typhoon Haiyan and between Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Katrina, we're able to see that even within one country, there are inequalities which mean that some people are more likely to be displaced by these kind of events than others. And then finally, by looking with a bit more focus just at Hurricane Katrina, we can see that even within one particular event hitting one particular location, there are factors to do with wealth and to do with race, specifically in New Orleans, that meant that some people in that particular area were more likely to be displaced than others. So we can look at inequality on a number of different scales there, globally between the US and the Philippines, then nationally within the US between the East Coast where Hurricane Sandy struck and New Orleans where Hurricane Katrina struck, and then a kind of city level or state level within New Orleans where certain people lived in, as a result of being on much lower incomes, lived in much lower low-lying areas and in much poor quality housing, and in turn how that income inequality was playing out along racial lines and led to very different patterns of displacement amongst different people within that city. So that's really why this lecture is called Our Unequal World, because it's really about trying to show how it's these differences in wealth, in income, in the wealth and income of people individually, in the wealth and income of the countries they live in the wealth and income of the parts of those countries that they live in, that very often determines whether they are forced from their home, whether they are displaced by these kinds of events or not. Okay, so that sort of pretty much wraps up our examination of typhoons and hurricanes. And what I want to do now is move on to looking at droughts. And we're going to look at two droughts. We're going to look at the Horn of Africa drought, and we're going to look at the drought in California. So just to give you a little bit of context to both of these, the East Africa Horn of Africa drought, when people talk about it, they're very often referring to the drought that took place between 2011 and 2012 in the Horn of Africa. Now, that's slightly confusing because there is also currently, right now, a drought in the Horn of Africa, which is having consequences, obviously, for migration and displacement and creating various other kinds of humanitarian crises. But I wanted to look specifically at these 2 years of drought in 2011 and 12, partly because they were particularly severe years of drought, but also because they coincided with various changes in some of the ongoing armed conflicts that were taking place in the area. And for that reason, it gives us some particular insights into how migration and displacement caused by drought can create even more complex situations when it interacts with migration and displacement caused by conflict as well. So that's why we're looking at the 2011-12 Horn of Africa drought. The second drought that we're looking at is the California drought between 2011 and 2017. Again, this is slightly confusing because there is a drought happening now in California as well, but the years between 2011 and 2017 were particularly severe. They were particularly severe. So for that reason, we're looking a bit more specifically at those years. So what I'm going to do is follow a similar kind of pattern to when we were looking at typhoons and hurricanes. I'm going to give you a bit of an outline of what took place in these droughts, and then we're going to look at how these droughts resulted or didn't result in various kinds of migration and displacement, and then try and examine what it is about the differences between these areas that resulted in those differences in migration and displacement. Okay, so the 2011-12 Horn of Africa drought, a sort of potted history of it is essentially that there were major decreases in rainfall, and that in turn led to two things. Firstly, widespread crop failure, and secondly, a huge unavailability of water, creation of water shortages. And the result of those two things was widespread migration and displacement. So in response to food shortages and in response to water shortages, lots and lots of people moved. Okay, the mobility, however, was complex, and it involved lots of different kinds of human movement. So it involved both migration and displacement. So it involved people moving at the end of the migration displacement spectrum, right? Whose movement we would describe very much as displacement. It involved people moving essentially because they had no choice, and moving from where they were to somewhere else was essentially an act of survival, and they were hoping that they would be able to, probably walk somewhere and either receive humanitarian aid in a refugee camp, or at least get to somewhere where there was food and water available. So their migration was much more, their movement was much more like displacement. However, the drought also produced widespread human movement that we might characterize as being more towards the migration end of the spectrum. So as the drought approached in the months and years running up to its kind of peak of severity, lots and lots of farmers, lots of people in agricultural areas started to move into cities as farming income declined. So it created multiple patterns of mobility. It created displacement when people moved in desperation, but as the drought began to take hold in the early stages of the drought, it also created human movement that was more like migration, as people found that their income was declining. And what we can see there is that the people who were slightly wealthier, were better able to move, were perhaps a bit younger, were physically able, very often engaged in patterns of human movement towards the beginning of the drought that we would describe as more like migration. Basically, they got out while they could, and they went and tried to find work somewhere else as farming income declined. People who were less able to move, either because they didn't have the money to move, because they were less physically able to move, or because they had kind of fewer migratory options, they didn't have anywhere obvious to move to, essentially were stuck, and then had to wait and were displaced and finally moved as an act of survival as a last resort. So the drought created human mobility right across that spectrum, okay, in a way that the hurricane strikes didn't, the way that the hurricanes and typhoons didn't. So the mobility that was caused by the drought, the mobility that was driven by the drought, also interacted with several ongoing armed conflicts that were taking place in the area. So what you see when you step back from the whole region during those years and you look at everyone who was on the move, is you see lots of people moving as a result of the drought, engaging in both migration and displacement. But you also see lots of people who, quite separately from the drought, are being displaced by armed violence. And then during 2011 and 12, what you see is those two patterns, those two driving forces of mobility colliding. And one of the studies actually that we looked at earlier in the course during the research methods lecture is one of the key studies for understanding, firstly, these 2 years in the Horn of Africa, but also understanding how those two driving forces of mobility collided. And what you see in that study by the UN Refugee Agency is interviews with people in refugee camps in the Horn of Africa, in East Africa, describing in many cases how they were forced to move first by the drought and then after that being displaced by the conflict. Or, for example, moving as a result of armed conflict and then having to move again as a result of the drought. And what you often found in the refugee camps that expanded during those years was people with a complete diversity of experience. People who are being solely displaced by water shortages and drought, people who are being solely displaced by armed conflict, and people who've been displaced multiple times, sometimes by the consequences of drought and sometimes by armed violence. So what you have during those 2 years, and to some extent, to a large extent actually still today, is incredibly complicated patterns of human mobility resulting from the drought, but then also interacting with conflict. Okay, so a very complicated situation involving several other forces other than the drought itself. Now, I appreciate that was a bit of a long overview of the situation, but it is needed so that we can start to try and compare the Horn of Africa drought to the drought in California. Excuse me, just having some water, and we'll carry on. So the California drought, in many ways, I'm going to offer a much less in-depth explanation of it. So, and I'll come to the reason for that in a second. Essentially, between 2012 and 2017, the drought in California went through its most severe years. The consequences of it largely were problems with agriculture, water shortages, resulting in, to some extent, crop failures, and especially as we've seen recently, widespread wildfires, forest fires, resulting from the progressive drying out of forest areas until the point where eventually they catch fire, and the progressive dryness that has been caused then makes those initial fires very, very difficult to put out. So it's difficult to say how many people migrated or were displaced by the drought in California. And that's partly because the humanitarian organizations that are involved in the drought in the Horn of Africa haven't been involved in the situation in California. And that means that less data is collected about people's mobility. However, what we do know is that there has been some displacement, certainly resulting from the forest fires. However, the kind of key and almost blindingly obvious point here is that while the drought in the Horn of Africa resulted in large-scale, widespread human mobility, the drought in California, although its consequences were severe and the impacts on the human population were severe and distressing, I'm not trying to detract from the fact that people have suffered and their lives have been difficult, but nonetheless, it resulted in much less migration and displacement. It didn't have huge human mobility consequences in the way that the drought in the Horn of Africa did. Okay, so the big question for us is, why was that? Now, there are several reasons here that are essentially a recap of what we looked at when we looked at the differences between Hurricane Sandy and Typhoon Haiyan. So I'll go over them briefly again before looking at some new points. So first up, long developed countries that have got a history of high levels of economic growth, high levels of wealth, have built infrastructure, which means that they are better able to deal with drought, right? Having extensive and very robust water storage and management systems means that some places are better able to deal with drought than others. And that's obviously true of California. It's obviously true of California being one of the wealthiest regions on the planet. Its water management infrastructure is very, very different and far more advanced and much better able to deal with drought than the water management infrastructure in many places in the Horn of Africa. And that's one of the key reasons why the Horn of Africa drought resulted in more migration and displacement than the drought in California did. Okay. However, there's another reason that we need to put into the mix here, which is another dimension to this, which we haven't covered yet, which we couldn't really see or examine when we were just looking at the sudden onset events before. One of the key reasons why the Horn of Africa drought resulted in so much human mobility is the fact that so many people, a much higher percentage of the population, are dependent on agriculture. Many more people in the Horn of Africa work in agriculture than do so in California, right? And that's important for two reasons. Firstly, more people are dependent on agriculture for their income. So more people's livelihoods are badly impacted by drought. And therefore, those people are more likely to migrate early on if they can, or eventually be displaced when farming becomes impossible. But also, more people are dependent, or not completely dependent, but partly dependent on agriculture for their actual food intake, right? Lots of people in the Horn of Africa region eat a fair amount of what they grow, as well as selling some of it. So actually, many more people are dependent on agriculture for their income and for their immediate food needs. Now, the situation in California is just completely different. Lots of people there are reliant on agriculture for their income, but a lower percentage of the population, and hardly anyone is dependent on agriculture for their immediate food needs or the immediate food needs of their community. California, pretty much like the rest of America and other developed countries, is plugged into a global food supply chain. And that means that when a drought hits California, it may well be that there are some changes in what's available in the shops, or some changes in the prices of some products. But by and large, a huge amount of the food that people are buying and consuming in California is imported anyway, and a huge amount of the food that is grown in California is grown for export. So a drought, while it does have severe impacts on agriculture and on people's incomes, doesn't actually have a direct consequence in terms of the food that they have available for them. In the Horn of Africa, obviously, that was very different. And lots of areas were dependent on growing food specifically in that locality in order to provide people with their actual daily intake of calories that they needed. So when the drought strikes and that food growing becomes difficult or impossible, people are forced to move, whereas that simply wasn't the case in California. Now, one of the patterns of economic development, one of the patterns that we see as countries become richer, is that fewer people work in agriculture. As countries' wealth increases, agriculture becomes more mechanized, the service economy or kind of industrial activity grows, and more people are employed in those areas, and fewer people are employed in agriculture. Similarly, as countries develop economically, their food supply systems tend to be more plugged into global markets. They tend to grow more food for export. They tend to import more of the food that they're eating, and they are therefore admittedly vulnerable to changes in those in the economics of global food supply, but less vulnerable perhaps to the impacts of drought, which might prevent people from growing the actual food that they need in their locality. So again, what we're seeing is global patterns of wealth determining whether people are forced to migrate or whether they are displaced. So that covers, I hope that covers really the kind of key driving forces, the differences between the circumstances that people find themselves in during those kinds of disasters, whether they're hurricanes or typhoons and droughts, and why those differences, why those inequalities, whether they're global inequalities, whether they're national, whether they're even inequalities that exist at a very local level, why those inequalities result in different patterns of migration and displacement. So what I want to do now is kind of give a quick summing up of those key points. So why is it that in the face of a disaster, whatever kind of disaster it is, whether it's a drought, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a flash flood, a typhoon, why is it that some people are displaced and some people are not? Why is it that some people migrate and some people don't? Why is it that some people engage in different kinds of human mobility and other people engage in other kinds of mobility? Okay, so the key reasons as a summary are, firstly, that long-term wealth and infrastructure matters. A history of high-quality building and infrastructure is going to be more resilient to climate change impacts. Okay. Secondly, planning, evacuation, and recovery matter. Okay, but these things, so planning for how to cope with disasters, having really robust evacuation plans, and having money to invest in recovery mean that people are more likely to be able to return quickly after they've been displaced. And it also means that they're likely to experience less distress during their displacement, or possibly even that they might not be displaced at all. But all of those things, planning, evacuation, disaster resilience, and recovery, require investment. And that means that places that are better off are more likely to be able to do more of those things. And the consequences are that people are less likely to be displaced, less likely to be displaced long term, and less likely to suffer during the displacement they experience. Okay, so both of those things, infrastructure and planning and recovery, are basically to do with income and wealth. The next thing is your government's ability or wish or desire to protect you is really key. So it is, of course, the case that some countries have the ability to protect their citizens well from these kinds of events, to prevent them from being displaced, to build infrastructure for them, around them, that can potentially prevent their displacement, but nonetheless, for all kinds of different social reasons, which may be to do with ethnicity or race or religion, or particularly favored geographical regions within a country, many governments choose to invest more money in disaster preparedness and infrastructure than in other areas. Okay, so a government's desire to protect a certain group of people, or its desire not particularly to protect a certain group of people, is important too. It is about governments choosing who they protect and choosing whether they protect everyone or whether they protect a small group of people, or whether they choose to neglect a particular group of people, that determines whether people are displaced or not, as well as simply the amount of money overall that a government has to invest. Okay, that's point 3. Point number 4 is that conflict matters, as do other drivers of migration and displacement. Places that are experiencing ongoing conflict are far more likely to experience high levels of displacement during disasters when they strike. And that's partly because those countries have already had their infrastructure weakened by those conflicts, and because people are already vulnerable and therefore more likely to be displaced when those disasters strike. Finally, agriculture matters. So one of the key forces behind whether people move or not as a result of disasters, and especially events like drought and desertification, is agriculture, and the number of people who work in agriculture and the extent to which an area is dependent on its own agriculture for its own food needs is a big determining factor in whether people are forced to leave that area during a drought or not. So I hope what I've done there is give a quick kind of summary of what those key drivers are that we've covered by exploring them through the various events and disasters that we've looked at over the session. So what I can do now is, I've been talking for nearly an hour, so we should have some, hopefully have some time for some questions before we wrap up. Leanne is on the chat and has been posting some of those questions to me as we go along. So what I'm going to do is just try and have a look at some of those questions and see if we can answer a few of them. Okay, so we've got one about the drought in Syria. Okay, so I can say something quickly about Syria and drought because that is a key example of where conflict and drought have intersected. And that looks like all we've got coming in at the moment. So let me say something quickly about that, and then let's wrap up. Okay, so I think, yeah, Syria is a really interesting case, and I think it's also a very worthwhile case of looking at in terms of how political forces and drought and conflict conspired to create a very particular pattern of displacement. The reason that I didn't look at it extensively in this session is we are going to look at it in one of the case studies at the end of the course in sessions 9 and 10. But I'll say a couple of things. Firstly, I think what you could see in Syria was a severe drought which created extensive movement, extensive migration within Syria. And that was largely people leaving agricultural areas and heading to cities. And what happened at that point was that because of the regime in Syria, there was a kind of nascent or kind of bubbling potential for an uprising. And as people moved into cities, what they found was that they were mixing with people that they hadn't mixed with or seen or known before, that there were now enough people in cities and enough energy behind beginning an uprising that one eventually took hold. And at that point, the regime in Syria tried to put down those uprisings, but it didn't completely quash them. At the same time, the rebelling forces didn't manage to entirely overthrow the regime, resulting in a sort of in a stalemate, essentially, in an ongoing protracted conflict. So it's a very, very complex case. And what you can see there is how, one of the key driving forces, I would say there, that we didn't look at here is the type of government and whether the government that is governing a country is an oppressive one or not, and whether that plays into the extent to which a region or a whole country is capable of coping with an event like a drought. We will look in a lot more depth later in the course at Syria because it's a very, very important case study. But I hope that's answered that question. I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to just say a few final things before I go. So first up, thank you for joining us for this session. Secondly, you can rewatch this whenever you want. It's going to be available to rewatch on YouTube almost immediately afterwards. Thirdly, keep an eye on your inboxes because early next week, I will be sending around some further reading and a task which draws on what we've covered in this session and is your chance to explore some of these issues in more depth and to investigate them independently if you wish. So keep an eye out for that. The next session is actually quite soon. It's in 2 weeks' time, so not next week, but the week after. And I will include details of that session when we will be looking at the idea of security in next week's mailing. So finally, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Leanne for being on the chat, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.